Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. My goodness gracious. I have been hearing everybody on Twitter talk about stagflation. You remember the 1970s when we had high rates of unemployment and we had a declining economy. We had negative GDP. We had inflation. We had recessions. We had all these things combined. I mean, you remember Arthur Burns, Paul Volcker, gold ripping higher in the 1970s. We've definitely seen gold ripping higher lately. So this begs the question, are we headed toward stagflation? Are we headed towards a inflationary recession? And to highlight this, let's go over a question from a member of Rebel Capitals Pro. Now, every Sunday night, I do a members only live stream where they submit questions and I answer their questions directly. I do this. Lynn Alden does this. Brent Johnson, Chris McIntosh, Patrick Seresna, Jason Hartman. These are the pros in Rebel Capitals Pro. I do it every week. They do it once a month. So let's look at this question because I think this really hits the nail on the head. And this is kind of what everyone is concerned with right now in the FinTwit space and the sound money space and the gold guys and the Bitcoin guys. So I've kind of cropped it just so you couldn't see this person's name. But here we go. I have an interest rate question. It was triggered by watching Peter Schiff, and he predicted that after the Fed drops rates, because of trying to protect the markets when the crash happens, when what he's saying here is we go into a hard landing, a recession, unemployment spikes, and as a result, the Fed's going to drop rates. And because they've got rates too low based on the inflationary pressures, then that's going to exacerbate the rate of inflation. And then interest rates at the long end of the curve are going to skyrocket. And then that's going to create an even worse recession because then banks are going to have to raise their interest rates. And this is going to crush the housing market. This is going to crush the stock market. This is Peter's argument. But let's get back to the specific question. So he says, watching Peter Schiff, he predicted after the Fed drops rates because of trying to protect the markets, when the crash happens, the banks providing mortgages will keep raising them to keep up with inflation. This is the long end of the curve going up. As he is predicting stagflation, I don't really understand this, as they didn't raise them to 10% when we had inflation running that high. Very perceptive of this Rebel Capitalist Pro member. Very, very, very perceptive. So since this is really the talk of the town right now, that the Fed dropped 50 basis points instead of 25, and therefore, oh my gosh, inflation is going to rip higher. But the economy is also going to tank, and the unemployment rate is going to go up, and we're going to have a recession. And all of this is going to happen at the same time. It's funny because when we'll just say like the zero hedge, we'll just use them as kind of like a proxy. It's like they have to start with buy gold and buy Bitcoin. And then they have to solve to that conclusion. Like they don't start with, well, what's going on and what are the probabilities? They start with buy gold and Bitcoin, and then they solve to get to that point, right? And what I'm saying here is they'll argue that we're going to have a recession, unemployment's going to skyrocket, all of these things. And you sit there and listen to them speak in their arguments, and you're like, man, that sounds really deflationary. So they'll sit there and say the stock market's going to crash, the economy's going to crash, we're going to go into a hard landing, unemployment's going to skyrocket, all these things. And that's why we're going to have hyperinflation. Like everything they're arguing is disinflationary, but yet they just, oh shit, I got to solve for Bitcoin and gold. Therefore, it's inflationary. Now, I don't mean to pick on my good buddy Peter Schiff. Super smart guy, great guy. Peter's an awesome, awesome dude in real life. I've got massive amount of respect for him. I'm just kind of using him as a proxy for the argument for stagflation because, you know, he's such a prominent figure. This is not a personal attack on any of these guys because most of these guys are my good friends. And again, I've got massive amount of respect for them. I just completely, and totally disagree. And here's why. It's not that I just disagree. Here's why. I'm going to show the receipts here. So the argument is for an inflationary recession. There's a problem. You see, that's not a thing. It might exist in hyperinflation, Weimar Germany, Venezuela, something like this, Zimbabwe, but it's not a thing in the United States. And you say, George, what are you talking about? Look at the 1970s. And we went over this in a video last week. What are you talking about? The 1970s, high unemployment, recessions, inflation. There you go. Recessionary or inflationary recession. But I think what's ironic here is this really doesn't include a thorough analysis of actually what happened in the 1970s. So let me explain. I want to look at the 1970s, but then I want to go all the way back to the 1950s. And let's see if we can actually find an example of an inflationary recession. So unemployment rate spikes and inflation is going up at the same time. We'll start with the, and what I'm going to do here, well, I was going to use the SOM rule. I used that last time. Let's just flat out use the unemployment rate. Easy peasy. So we'll start with the 1970s, and we'll go through this fast because I reviewed this on a video last week. But the punchline here is we can see in the unemployment rate really start to spike in, you know, call it Q3 or so of 74. And then into, let's just say, the middle parts of 75. Cool. So let's see what inflation was doing during that time. This red line is consumer price inflation, and I can go ahead and zoom in on the 1970s specifically, and then we'll zoom out to look at those other time frames. So here we go. Let's look at 1974 Q3, and it is right around here. Let's see where the red line is. And then we start to see unemployment rate spike, which is what you get in a recession. And even in the 1970s, what happened to the consumer prices? Now, it's not that they went down. That's not what I'm saying. It's that the CPI went down. So prices increased at a slower rate. In other words, we had disinflation. We didn't have accelerating rates of inflation, which is what the argument is. Again, they're not arguing that we're going to have the unemployment rate spike. We're going to have this huge recession, hard landing, and the CPI, as measured by the government, is going to remain at 2.5%. Or that it's going to go down to 1.5%, but that's still inflation, therefore stagflation. That's not their argument. Their argument is we get the hard landing, we get the recession, unemployment rate spikes, and the CPI goes up, goes straight up. They're arguing that we get a red line that looks like this. Let's say starting in 70, was that 76? I'll read the fine print here. So their argument is that the CPI does this, not that the CPI does this, but yet it's still inflation or prices are still going up. Okay, I want to be clear. So it would be the exact same thing. In fact, to an even greater degree in 1980, when we saw the unemployment rate spike right in here. And then we saw inflation really go down, and we saw it go down. And it's not like it just goes down temporarily and then zoom comes right back up. No, in this disinflationary period during the 1970s, it lasted 2 years. This one lasted 3 years approximately. And in fact, it lasted basically 40 years. If you want to get really technical. But this one lasted 2. Let's see, because we're here. Yeah, it lasted at least 2 years of disinflation, not of accelerating inflation. Okay, now let's zoom out. And we don't want to zoom out that far. Okay, because our unemployment chart only goes to 1950. So let's go to the late 40s, when most of you guys know from watching my videos, we had another massively inflationary decade where inflation got up to almost 20% in 47, and then Wile E. Coyote goes straight down to negative 2.86%. In other words, deflation. Okay, let's go to our unemployment chart and recessions. And by the way, these gray bars, I know most of you know, but for those of you who are new to the channel, gray bars indicate recession, hard landing. So right here, we see the unemployment rate in 1948, right around 3.6%. Ironically, pretty much where we started 6 months ago or so. Our low, I think, was 3.4%. And then we see throughout 1948 and into 49, the unemployment rate spikes. Exactly like we'll call them zero hedge types, are predicting for 2025. So 1949, be clear again, and 48, 49, unemployment spikes, recession. Great. Now let's go and see what happened to inflation. So right here, we're at 48 and June of 48, and we're at 9.55%. And then we go to 49. We're at -2. All right. So definitely not an inflationary recession. That is a disinflationary recession, meaning that even if prices are going down, or excuse me, even if prices are going up, they're going up to a much lesser degree, not to a greater degree. But let's not stop there. I mean, I want people to realize that when I disagree with people who I respect and who are incredibly smart, or I say things on Twitter, I say things on a whiteboard video or something, I'm not just pulling this out of my rear end. It's not like I'm just trying to be an asshole. It's not like I'm trying to just troll people for engagement. That's what I always get accused of. If I have an opinion that's contrary to someone, let's say in the sound money space. No, this is my view, not because I'm trying to be a jerk. This is my view because I look at the data, and the data leads me to a completely separate conclusion. So let's get back to it. Chart. So we see 53 to, we really see it spike there at the late stages of 53. So we'll go over here to 52, 53. And then we see it spike. We see it go up just a fraction. But keep in mind the CPI here was 75 basis points. It goes up just to 1.5 and then right back down in 54 after we had that spike of inflation back down to 75 basis points. Actually, I'm sorry. It went down to 37 basis points. So inflation pretty much went down to zero. Okay. So definitely not a quote unquote inflationary recession there either. Let's go to call it 57 into 58. So 57 into 58. You see it flat. And then as you would expect, after the unemployment rate spikes, or sometimes during, we get disinflation. Let's look at 1960. So we're looking right at the beginning and end of 1960. So beginning, we're roughly 1.73, and it goes, doesn't go down by a lot, but it sure as hell doesn't go up. So it goes down to a point right here in 61, call it, where we're 67 basis points. So pretty much zero inflation. And if you do this in every single one of these, even 1970, let's not forget the one, the recession and spike in unemployment that we had in 1970, 69 into 70. Let's look at that one. We're right here, 1970, 69, 70, unemployment rate spikes. And what happens to the red line? It goes down, not up. Just like it did in 1974, 75, and just like it did in 1980. So even when you look, and even when you include the 1970s, I cannot, and obviously, if we were to fast forward to the 1990s, the 2000s, you guys don't need me to remind you that all of those recessions were not inflationary. That those were disinflationary. Right? So an inflationary recession isn't a thing. You can't show me a time in U.S. history when we had one of those. Now you say, George, the cerveza sickness. Well, we had inflation there. Yeah, we did. But you had the unemployment rate. Let's go back to that. You had the unemployment rate spike like this, and then it goes right back down. And then you had a period while we were in the recession. You did not have a period of consumer price inflation ripping higher. Now, when we came out of the recession, and the unemployment rate started to really drop, then absolutely we had a reacceleration of inflation, and it went up to 9%. But that's when we get on the other side of the recession. It's not when we're going into the recession. When you're in that recession, when unemployment rate is spiking, there's only one way that inflation goes, and that's down. That's down. That's not to say that prices are going down. It's to say that we have disinflation. Sometimes we do have outright deflation, but usually it's disinflation where prices are going up at a slower rate. So the punchline, guys, is when you actually look at U.S. history, you see the probability of us going into a hard landing while the unemployment rate spikes while inflation spikes as well, is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly low. And in my view, in all due respect, anyone that wants to argue this is their base case, you've got to go through some serious mental gymnastics, let's say, to sit here and argue all of these disinflationary things are going to just magically lead to inflation. And if you want to talk about, I know a lot of people on Twitter were talking about how this time it is different, George. This time it's different. This time it is different, damn it. Because the debt's 120% of GDP. And the Fed is going to have to print money, and the money supply is going to go up. Basically, that's their argument, is that the debt is so high, the deficits are so high. There's no way that we can manage these deficits. And therefore, we're going to have to, quote unquote, print money in order to buy the treasuries, because no one's going to buy our debt. Never mind the fact that the 10-year treasury is trading at 3.6%. And never mind the fact that the dollar is higher than it was in 2009 when we had $9 trillion in debt. We have $35 trillion today. Just completely ignore that. I don't want to hear about it. Well, okay, fine. If your argument is basically M2 money supply is going to increase and therefore this time it's different, I would refer you back to the 1970s and look at what the money supply did back then. And I would remind you that the money supply was going up at a much, 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 much faster rate than it is today, because today it's going down. So if your argument is today it's different because of the deficits are going to lead to, quote unquote, money printing, I would ask you why in the 1970s, when we saw M2 money supply going up at a much, much faster rate than it's been going up over the last 2 years, did we still have disinflationary recessions? All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure that you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market, capitalism. See you in the next video.